purpose of this lesson is to learn about modularization, abstraction, what a method is and how to create one, parameters, arguments, and return types, overloading methods, and passing an array to a method. When writing a computer program, we use a technique called modularization, and all that it means is that we simply break up our computer program into small parts. Each individual little part has a specific function. In prior lessons, you saw me use comments, so I would state that a section of code was to declare variables, and another section of code was to ask for input. Another section of code was for performing calculations, and then another section of code was to make some sort of output. Well, in real life, what we do is we actually have separate sections of code, complete separate sections of code that are responsible for doing this. There are a couple of reasons for doing it. One is we are able to break our program up into smaller pieces, which means smaller sections to actually write and troubleshoot. We allow multiple programmers to be able to work on the same program at the same time, so we can give individual programmers different tasks to actually perform. It makes troubleshooting easier, and then it also allows for what's called reusable code. Now, reusable code just simply means that I have a section of code that I can reuse over and over again. So let's say I'm writing a program that needs to print something out to a receipt printer. Well, instead of having a section of code to print out a cashier's receipt and another section of code to print out a gift certificate or something like that, I can have the same section of code that's responsible for printing those out, and the only thing that's different is the section of code that called it would be different. So this allows for this process called abstraction. Now, process of abstraction, as humans, we can think in an abstract term. So if I say, go make a sandwich, you can do that. But if I tell the computer, go make a sandwich, it doesn't understand it. So I'd have to tell the computer, stand up, walk towards the kitchen, open the door, and I'd have to tell it specifically how many steps to the kitchen, how to open the door, and so forth. So abstraction allows us to think about a computer program as general, vague ideas. So I have a section of code that's responsible for getting user input. I have a section of code that's responsible for performing calculations. And so what happens is we don't necessarily need to tell the computer program every single little step. And actually, every computer programming language does support abstraction to some level. We no longer have to tell the processor exactly how to perform a calculation. We don't have to tell it how to create a variable location for us. So we don't need assembly language anymore. And the way that we do this is through the use of what are called methods. So a method is a small section of code that is called by another section of code. We have an entry point to our program is called the main method. Methods can be static, which means that they can be called by name, or non-static, which means that we need to instantiate them. We actually make an object. Methods can contain their own variables, or they can use global variables. What happens is if I call a section of code, while that section of code is running, that method, it is said to be in scope. And when something is in scope, its variables, all of its methods and functions and everything, they're effectively what are being used at the time. Now, what happens is any variables that are created in a method are only available to the system while they're in scope. When the method is done running, all of the variables, all of the methods, all the objects that were created by that method go out of scope and they all become what's called deconstructed. So we have these things called parameters. I can send parameters to, I have a set of parameters in the method that I'm going to send information to. So my method knows that it's supposed to receive two numbers, and then maybe it adds those two numbers together. So the parameters are going to be what the method is expecting to receive. These are going to be variables that are local to this method, and then what we do is we pass values to these parameters. So the calling method, so let's say my main method is going to call a section of code to ask for user input. Then what we're going to do is we're going to pass arguments from the main method to the called method, and then the called method will put those values into its parameter list. We can pass these values by reference or by value. By reference just simply means that I can actually give another method direct access to the memory location that I have for my values. We'll actually get more into that in just a couple of minutes. A method can also have what's called a return type. Now, return type is just simply going to mean that my method, after it's done performing all of its calculations or whatever else it's supposed to do, may return some information back to the calling method. And if it returns something, it should return at most one type of data or one piece of information, or it could return nothing. And if it returns nothing, then we refer to this as a void. Now, if I'm returning something, then I have to return data in the exact same data type that the calling method is expecting it to be returned. We can overload methods. So what will happen sometimes, we'll have two methods that are almost identical, but the only thing that's different is their parameter list. And what we can do is we could create two separate parameters. So let's say I have one for adding two numbers and one for printing a number and a text string. Then what happens, I could have two completely separate methods, and I'd have to know which one of those two that I'm calling, or I could simply use what's called an overloaded method. So I call it, and if I call the method and I send two numbers, it knows what to do. If I call the method and I send a number and a text string, it knows what to do. If I call the method and I don't send anything, it knows what to do. And so this whole process is called polymorphism. It just simply means that we can use the same method. It understands different sets of parameters, and based on what's being sent to it, it would dictate what it's actually supposed to do or how it's supposed to act. The only problem with this is that we can encounter ambiguous methods. So let's say I have a method that's responsible for receiving two integers. And then I also have the exact same overloaded method that's responsible for receiving an integer and a double. Well, if I send two integers to it, which one is supposed to actually respond to that? And I may have meant for the double to be sent or to process it, but it may encounter where both the integers get processed. We can also pass arrays. Now, an array is a little bit different. I can pass one individual value from an array at a time, or we could actually pass the entire array by reference, which just simply means that we're going to give the method the ability to directly interface with the memory location for the array and make changes to whatever is contained in that array. All right, so I want to make a program that will demonstrate how to use the methods. And whenever you start a program, you always start with a main method. If you notice, it is a void and it's static. Now, static just simply means that this thing can be called by name, and that void means that it doesn't return anything back to whatever called it. Well, in the case of main, there is nothing that has called it, so therefore there is not going to be a return type. So what I want to do is I want to make this where it's able to call another method. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new method by simply pressing enter a couple of times. And I'm going to type the word static void because this is not going to return anything. And I'm going to call it say hello. And then inside of parentheses here, this is going to be a list of parameters. Now in this case, this one is not going to receive any parameters. So therefore, I'm just going to leave the parameter list blank. Inside of this method, I'm going to do a console.writeLine. And we're going to do our typical hello world. Alright, so this method is responsible for saying hello. Alright, so console.writeLine hello world is all that this method actually does. So the question is, how do I call it? Well, up here from our main method, remember the main method is always our entry point for the program. To actually call this, what I'm going to do is say hello, and if you notice if I start typing it, you'll see say hello. And then we just simply do open and close parentheses. Now the parentheses mean that this is a method, and by leaving it blank it just simply means I'm not sending any parameters to it. So now what I need to do here is I need to do my console.read. That way it doesn't go away when we start running the program. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and start this, and we get hello world. So the way that it worked is in our program, it went into the main method, it comes to say hello, and then what happens is it jumps down here to this method and performs whatever code is here, and then when it's done it goes right back to where it left off, and then it continues processing. So we're allowing it to kind of pause up here, process all this stuff here, and then go back up here and do this again. Alright, so if I want to change this a little bit, I can do something like say hello a couple of times. Alright, so now what it will do is it'll say hello 3 times. So what it did is it went into the main method, it went to say hello, It jumped down here to say hello. It does the code, which prints out hello world. This gets done. It goes right back to where it left off. Then it processes the next line, jumps down here, processes the code, goes right back to where it left off, does the next one, jumps down here, does the code, and then goes right back to where it left off, and then it's done. So the idea behind the methods here is that I can reuse that section of code over and over again without having to retype it. Because if I didn't have this right here, I would have to type this line of code 3 times up here to get it to do the same thing. Or I could do something like a loop that would keep doing it. But by making a separate method, all I have to do is just simply call it, and then when I call it, it will perform whatever function that method is supposed to do. Alright, so what I want to do is I want to modify this a little bit. So I'm going to get rid of the say hello, and we're going to rename this to add numbers. Okay, so I'm just simply calling it add numbers. And then what I want to do is I want it to ask the user for 2 numbers, and then we're going to add those together. So what I'm going to do is console.write, enter a number, and then the next line is going to be, we're going to put this into a variable. So I'm going to make a double variable called dblnum1, and we'll set that equal to console.read line. But the problem is this is going to be text, so I have to convert this. So I'm going to convert.to double whatever I read in through the command line there. Alright, so they type something in, we convert it to a double, stick it into this new double variable called dblnum1. Alright, so do the same thing. We're going to say console.write, enter another number, and then we're going to make another double variable called dblnum2, convert to, so it'll be exact same line here, console.readLine. Okay, so then what we're going to do is we're going to add those 2 numbers together. So just like we've been doing before, we're going to add these 2 numbers, and we're going to say something like console.writeLine, the sum of 0, which is going to be num1, and 1, which is num2, is, and then the sum of those 2. Okay, so that was dblnum1, dblnum2, and then this is going to be dblnum1 plus dblnum2. Okay, so now we need to call this section code. Now what happens is I haven't actually called it, and if I run my program right now, it actually does nothing. Alright, now what this is I actually just created a section of code that we can never get to because there's nobody that ever calls this section of code. Is it still there? Is it still available? Yes, it is, but we've made it where nobody can ever get to it because we just simply haven't called it. Alright, so now if I do add numbers, then it will call that section of code for me. So enter a number, 3, 5, and it adds those together. So this is just like what we did in prior lessons where we ask for 2 numbers and then we add those together. Alright, but what if I don't want this section of code to actually ask them? So I have this section of code here is asking for the numbers. Well, what I can do is I'm going to put this up here before we actually add the numbers together. So I'm going to pass some numbers over. And then what I want to do is I want to pass the numbers to add numbers, and then I want add numbers to add them together and then to display the output. Alright, so once I get the 2 numbers from the user, I want to call add numbers and I want to send those 2 numbers. Now I could hard code this. I could say that I want to pass 3 and 5 over to add numbers and those are the 2 numbers. But I don't want it to be hard coded. I want it to use the variables that the user has, the values of the variables that the user has entered. So what I want to do is I want to pass those over to this, but what happens is our parameter list for add numbers has to tell it that we're expecting 2 numbers to come in. Alright, so what's coming in is going to be a double value, and in this particular method I'm going to give it another name, And so what do I want the variable to be called? Because what happens is the variable name here and the variable name that are here, they're two completely separate variables. What happens is the scope of this variable only exists for the main method. So our add numbers method down here can't look at dblnum1 because it belongs to main. And the way that you can think of this is this variable name here, to be fully qualified, is actually main.dblnum1, and this is main.dblnum2. What that means down here is that under add numbers, the variables that are here are going to be add numbers dot whatever. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just simply going to call it num1, and I expect another double to come in called num2. Now, if I stick with my naming convention, it should be dblnum1 and dblnum2, but just so that you can see what happens here, I want you to see that these are different variables. Okay, so then what happens is I've actually declared these. This is the same as having a declaration for these variables. And as far as this add numbers method is concerned, we don't have a dblnum1 and a dblnum2. We only have num1 and num2. So I'm going to change these. Okay, so num1, num2, here's num1, num2, num1 plus num2. So I get the same type of output. But what happens is this has to be able to send these values over. Alright, so I'm going to send dblnum1 and dblnum2. And so what we're going to do is we're going to ask the user for these two numbers here. Then when we get those two numbers, we're going to pass those two numbers over to this method. This method will receive them and put them into num1 and num2, which are completely separate variables. Those two variables will become into scope, which means they're constructed when we call this method. This section of code will run, and then as soon as this section of code is done, these two variables will get deconstructed so they no longer exist. Then it jumps right back to where it was and continues on its way. So now if I run this, I'm going to ask for a number. So I am currently up here asking for a number. So I type 3, enter. Okay, I'm asking for another number here, 5, and then when I press enter, it's going to pass 3 and 5, and those are going to get put into here. So you have num1 will be 3, num2 will be 5, and it will still perform its calculations. So there we go. So now num1 is 3, num2 is 5, so that means num1 is 3, num2 is 5, and 3 and 5, so that's 8. So that's where they come from. Now when I got done with this, these variables, because that section of code ran and finished, num1 and num2 no longer exist. dblnum1 and dblnum2 do exist, but num1 and num2 do not because they went out of scope. Alright, so once I press enter, the whole program is done. So what happened is we passed those two values over to this method receives them, and then it processes them as if I had created new variables in that method and initialized them. Alright, so what I want to do now is I don't want this one to actually do the displaying of the values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this, and I'm going to put this here after add numbers. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these back to dblnum1, dblnum2, and then here what I want to do is I'm going to change this to dbl total, or let's call it dbl sum. Okay, what that means is that dbl sum needs to already exist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new double value called dbl sum and give it an initial value of 0. Okay, that'll satisfy this. Alright, so what happens is when we run our program right now, we're going to ask the user for a number. We ask for another number. We pass those two numbers over, and I want to pass them to this method, and I want this method to add those two numbers together and then pass those values back. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to specify that I have another parameter here which is an output for this method. And so what this means is that we're no longer going to be a void method. We're actually going to return something. And what I have to specify is the type of data that is going to be returned. So I'm going to return a double value. So what this means is that my add numbers method is going to pass back a double value that is going to be the sum of these. Alright, so now I get an error. We'll fix that in just a second. But essentially what it's saying is that now that I'm telling it that it has a return type, I need to specify that something does actually get returned. I want to specify what is being returned. Okay, so what I can do here is my parameter list, these are things that are coming into this method, but I want to specify things that are going to go back out and get returned to here. So to do that, I need a variable to hold the value that's going to get returned. So I'm going to make a new double value called dbl_sum, and I'm going to start it off at 0. And then dbl_sum is going to be equal to num1 plus num2, because those are our local variables here for this method. And then I want to return whatever is in dbl_sum. So what this will do is it'll take whatever is in dbl_sum and it'll send it back. And the way that this works is when I call add numbers, this whole section of code jumps down to here and calls this. It does all of its stuff, and then whatever is returned here replaces all of this. So for me to actually use this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set dbl_sum equal to whatever comes out of this method. So this returns dbl_sum, this is add numbers.dbl_sum, gets returned back to here, and that will get put into main.dbl_sum. And then it will display the value here. So what we're doing is we're breaking it down where our main method is responsible for asking for the numbers and displaying the output, but we have another section code down here that's actually responsible for doing the calculations. So I'm going to run the code. All right, I'm going to put a 3, I'm going to put a 5, and you'll see that I still get the same answer that I got before. So we asked for a number, we entered 3 here, 3 went into dbl_num1. I entered 5 here, 5 went into dbl_num2. We call dbl_num1, or call add numbers and send dbl_1 and dbl_num2. They get received into num1 and num2. Then those get processed and get added together and put together into dbl_sum, so that becomes 8. And then we return 8. And then when we return 8 back up here, all of this got replaced by the number 8, which gets put into dbl_sum here. And then our output just simply reads in the values for dbl_num1, num2, and sum. So when we call a method, if we send parameters, we have the ability to call it and expect a return type, or we have the ability to call it and not get any return data at all. I want to demonstrate one more thing, which is I said before that I can allow my other method to actually directly interface with my memory locations up here. The way that I'm doing this right now is I'm sending the value of dbl_num1. So if I typed in 3, the 3 gets sent over to this num1. And then this dbl_num2, if I type in 5, then the 5 gets sent over. But this has no clue what the actual memory location is for dbl_num1. If I want, I can allow this method to directly interface with these variable locations. And the way that I do that is I'm going to use a keyword called ref. And then what that is, it's a reference. So I'm going to type in ref before these, and then ref before these. And so what I'm doing is I'm telling it that I want to send not necessarily the value of dbl_num1, but I want to send the memory location of dbl_num1. And then what that does is this add numbers will create an alias for that memory location. So essentially num1 down here is the actual memory location of dbl_num1. So I'm no longer passing the value. I'm not passing 3. I'm passing the actual memory location for it. All right, so if I just run this, it'll look the same. So I do 3 and 5. I still get the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. But what would actually be different is if I come down here and I hard code that I want num1 to equal to 7 and num2 to equal to 8, then what will happen is if I type in 3 here, dbl_num1 becomes 3. If I type in 5, dbl_num2 becomes 5. Then what I expect to happen is we send over the 3 and the 5. The 3 and the 5 come over here, and we should get 8 back, and then it should display 8 as our output. But in reality, what will happen is that our code will be just a little bit different than what we expect to occur. All right, so I'm going to type in 3, I'm going to type in 5, and when I press enter, I expect it to tell me that the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. But in reality, what's going to happen is we're going to pass the 3 and the 5, I'm sorry, not the 3 and the 5, but the memory location of where the 3 and the 5 exist. and then we're going to overwrite that memory location with 7 and 8. And then what will happen is it will add 7 and 8 together. DBL sum will be 15. We return 15 back to here, and it will tell us that the sum of 7 and 8 is 15. And there we go. So because I use the reference says, hey, here is the memory location of this variable. You can directly modify it. Now be real careful with using the reference. Yes, it will work, but usually when we do methods, we really want this process called encapsulation, which means that we're trying to hide how our code works. We're trying to hide all of our variables so that way other methods can't directly modify them. So yes, like I said, this will work, but we usually want to try not to do reference. Now there is one time when we have to do reference, and that is when we start using arrays. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I want to use an array, and to show you how this works, we're going to have to modify this a little bit. So I'm going to get rid of the code in here, and actually I'm going to get rid of almost all of this. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to make an array that has 2 numbers in it. So we're going to have our 3 and our 5. So I'm going to make an integer array, and I'm going to call it my array is equal to a new int array of 2 characters in length, and we're going to give it 3 and 5. Okay, so here's our new array. It has two elements in it. Its length is 2. 3 and 5 are the 2 elements. Alright, and what I want to do is I want to call add numbers. But instead of passing 3 and 5 over to add numbers, I actually want to pass the entire array. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over our array by reference to our other method and specify that we're going to put it into some array alias over in that method. Alright, so for our method, we're going to pass something in by reference. It's going to be an integer array, and we're going to call it numArray over here, just to give it an alias. Okay, so numArray and myArray are actually going to be the same array. Alright, and then what I want to do is I want to call add numbers. So I'm going to do like I did before. So DBL sum is going to be equal to add numbers. But what I'm doing is I'm passing by reference myArray. And so what this will let me do is I can pass this reference back over here. I can pass my array, which is this local array. This will create an alias for it, it'll know the memory location for it, and we can directly modify it. Alright, so what I want to do is I'm going to make a new double value here called DBL sum, and we're going to start this off at 0. Okay, and then what we're going to say is DBL sum is equal to numArray element 0 plus numArray element 1. And then we're going to return DBL sum. And I'm actually getting an error here because I created an integer array. I want this to be a double array. So let's make this double, and we'll make it a new double array. And we'll make this 3.0 and 5.0, just to satisfy it being doubles. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this array, we're going to pass it by reference over to add numbers. And then this is going to expect a double array. Alright, so we'll pass it over by reference, which means that we are telling add numbers where to locate that array. So we're telling it the actual memory location for it. Then we're going to take the first element out of there plus the second element out of there and add that into double and put that in a double sum. And then we're going to return double sum. Now we still have an error here because I had a curly bracket instead of a square bracket. But if I fix that, now that error goes away. So we're going to pass over these two. Now this is no longer DBL num1 and DBL num2. This is going to be my array element 0, and then we're going to have my array element 1, and then DBL sum, because DBL sum really is going to be whatever comes back out of this. So we create the array. It has 2 elements in it, 3.0 and 5.0. Then we call add numbers. We pass this entire array by reference. This add numbers creates an alias for it. It calls it numArray. We declare a new variable to hold the sum. The sum is going to be equal to the first two elements added together. We return that sum. That comes back. All of this will get replaced with 8.0, which will be put into DBL sum, and then we simply display the output there. Okay, so the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. Now the question is, why did it do 3 and 5? If it is a double that ends in a 0.0, it will automatically truncate the last number. So if I were to actually make this 3.2, it'll still work, and you'll notice the 5 is a 5.0, so it automatically just simply makes it a 5. And then the 8.2 here is formatted because of the 3.2. So this is passing an array by reference. The other option would be, if I didn't want to do it this way, I could pass each individual thing. I'd have to have separate calls for each thing that's in the array. But I really don't want to do that when I'm playing with methods unless I have some specific reason to do it. We typically try to pass the array by reference. The last thing I want to show you is how to do overloaded methods. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the code that's here. And we're not going to return anything here, so we're going to make this a void. And instead of being add numbers, I'm going to call it my method. And once again, the parameter list is going to be a little bit different, so we'll fix this in just a second. Alright, so what I want to do is I want to show you how we actually would overload a method. Alright, so I'm going to make this same method, and I'm going to call it my method, and I'm going to put it for an integer called int num1, and another integer called int num2. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the exact same method, so my method, and this time int num1, and then a string str name. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just simply say console.writeLine, you entered the method for 2 integers. Okay, so just to let you know which method you got into. And then this one's going to be a console.writeLine, you entered the method for an integer and a string. Okay, so what I want to do is I just want to show you how to get into these. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call my method. And what I want to do is I'm going to pass the number 3 and the number 5 to it. Okay, so if I call my method and I pass 3 and 5, it will enter this one, because what it does is it has this parameter list that says, okay, you sent an integer and another integer, so we're going to enter it into this method. Okay, so if I run this, you entered the method for 2 integers. But if I were to do something like my method 3, 5, and Bob. Okay, so now what will happen is I have 3 and a string, so it says an integer and a string, and it will go into the method for an integer and a string. Alright, so now I can enter what's called ambiguous methods, which if I do 3.2 and Bob, now I have a problem because it doesn't know what to do with 3.2 and Bob. There's no method down here to handle if we send something that doesn't actually match up. So what I'm sending is a double and a string. I don't have anything defined for a double and a string, and so it gets confused and doesn't understand. So overloaded methods are great because I can send information over to the method and not necessarily have to worry about the parameter list, because if you send a number and another number, it goes to the one with the 2 numbers. But if I send the wrong type of number, it doesn't know what to do with it. And this is called an ambiguous method, and you just want to be careful when you overload them that you don't come up with an ambiguous method like this. So if I were to do something like Bob and the number 3, okay, once again, it's still ambiguous because there's nothing that says a string and an integer. Yes, this one takes a string and an integer, but they have to be in the exact same order for it to work. In this lesson, you learned about modularization, which is breaking up our program into small sections of code that allows multiple programmers to work on it, or allows us to easily create and troubleshoot small sections of code instead of a large program. You learned about abstraction, which is the concept of not necessarily specifying every individual little step when we first start writing our program. we are going to specify that our modules are each responsible for a function. You learned what a method is and how to create one. You learned about the parameter list, arguments, and different return types. You learned how to overload methods and also how to pass an array to a method, and make sure you understand that you have to pass it by reference or you have to pass each individual array element.